Hi everybody, welcome back to STEMtalk. I'm Whitney Reid, Coordinator of Curriculum Design at STEMscopes.
Hi, and I'm Reid Whitaker, founder of STEMscopes and the Chief Academic Officer of Accelerate Learning. So Whitney, let's talk STEM.
Let's talk STEM.
Today our talk is all about data, collecting, analyzing, and using data to drive instruction. So the first question I have that I think a lot of people ask is, what is data?
Well, when we say data, what we really mean is information that's usually numeric that represents student mastery on a set of curriculum. That curriculum can be mandated by the state or some local entity. So how do we get that data?
Well, we usually get data by evaluating student performance on assessments. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean paper and pencil tests. There are plenty of other ways of assessing students. Performance tasks, response to question prompts. And while we understand that multiple choice items are very easy to use and they're the most common for assessing students, sometimes they don't provide a holistic picture of student understanding or even thinking. So while some people might not think that performance-based assessments can provide much insight, they really can't. And you can also collect data just as easily as you would with any type of quantitative assessments. Whitney, I have a question for you though. Why do we collect data?
Well, we collect data for a number of reasons, but one reason is just to collect grades. Most schools are established on this system whereby we rank students according to their performance. But by focusing only on this, we're missing a big piece of the puzzle because really, collecting data can be used to inform instruction. We should inform instruction in 3 different ways. One, we can assess before the instruction takes place so that we have a good picture of what the kids know ahead of time.
Right.
We can also assess during the actual instruction, and that's where you can make adjustments to the learning that you're offering your students. What things need to be added, what things maybe can be taken away, do we need to go back, do we need to dive deeper? Those kinds of things can all be done while you're in the middle of the learning so that it's not done too late. Which brings me to the next point. We can also assess after the instruction has taken place, and that really just provides you that measure of how well did they do overall. So what kinds of data should we collect?
Well, there's many ways to collect data, and generally you collect data through assessments. There are commonly 2 types of assessments that we use to collect data and to use data. One is formative assessments. You can think of a formative assessments like going to a doctor or a checkup.
Okay.
You go, you get advice, you get prescriptions, you get things to improve upon. And that's what formative assessments are. You can use those to continuously improve your performance throughout. And usually formative assessments are given throughout the year at an interim basis and ongoing. So they're used several times throughout the year. You can include very informal assessments like dialoguing with students or collecting samples of work. And even formal assessments such as quizzes or response to question prompts, but you're always going to use that data to improve the student learning. Then we also have what are summative assessments. And summative assessments are really like the autopsy. It's the big deal, the big one.
Too late.
Usually the big high-stakes exams in states that we have,
Okay.
those are our summative assessments. And while you can still use that data to improve student performance, it really is kind of like a collection of a benchmark or a big deal. And most of them are multiple choice assessments. And really there are 2 types of summative assessments out there that students can take. You have your criterion referenced assessment. And your criterion referenced assessment, it's going to measure students on learning objectives, standards, learning outcomes. And if students score proficiency on a certain number of those standards, then they'll score mastery. And really, they're just benchmarked against that learning scale. However, you also have norm-referenced exams. Now, norm-referenced exams also have learning outcomes, but it compares a student across other students that take the exam, such as like you get a percentile, like the SAT.
Okay.
That's a norm-referenced exam.
Okay. Well, you know what I'm going to bring up.
Let me guess. Performance tasks.
Yes. My favorite type of assessments are performance tasks. I feel like they're such a better way to get a whole picture of what's going on with the students' thinking. And the thing about performance tasks is they can provide quantitative data. They can provide quantitative data if you build high quality rubrics, and that just helps to make sure that the grading is done systematically and objectively, and that there's no room for, opinion or teacher bias. Then you can use that data collected to compare across individual students, but also between groups of students to get a good picture of what's going on. And then also open-ended responses. If you take those student samples and you norm them and then use a student guide, we'll also be able to provide you quantitative data.
Yeah, that's great.
So I just want to point out that those kinds of assessments can offer a great amount of quantitative data in addition to the multiple choice assessments.
Okay. Cool.
So once we have all this data, Reid, what do we do with it? How do we break it down?
Breaking down the data. How do we do that, huh? Well, first of all, you have to start with at the beginning and of looking at building assessments. You need to make sure that every component of your assessment is tightly aligned to a learning standard. So here's an example from a curriculum you may know a little bit about. Have you heard of STEMscopes?
I think maybe once
Does
or
it ring
twice.
a bell?
It rings a
Okay.
bell, yeah.
So we actually have done this in STEMscopes, and it's throughout the program. But what it is we have an example up of a module that is over a 5th grade learning standard about light. You can see that the entire module is based on that learning standard. And as you can see, there's a student expectation.
Okay.
And the student expectation says that it expects the student to demonstrate that light travels in a straight line until it strikes an object or travels through one medium to another, and demonstrate that light can be reflected, such as the use of mirrors or other shiny surfaces, and refracted, such as the appearance of an object when observed through water. So if you look at that standard, then now let's look at an assessment question that we can build based off that learning standard. If you look at our post-assessment from the same module of 5.6C Light, you'll look at question number 4. And question number 4 has a diagram of a periscope, and the diagram shows a periscope used to see objects that are behind or under a barrier. And the question is, what makes it possible to see an object when looking through a periscope? The periscope, and it has several different choice questions. But as you can tell in the learning standard, it talks about understanding that light can be reflected, such as through the use of mirrors. And we see that one of those answer choices is A, contains mirrors that reflect the object. So you see the connection there between the assessment and the learning standard. It's directly aligned.
Yeah, and that raises an excellent point in that it is very important to employ what we call backwards design, whereby you build the assessments prior to building the learning experiences, and you make sure that those assessments are tightly aligned to the learning standard. It just helps to make sure that everything is sort of setting that student up for success on the assessment if you begin with the end in mind.
Right, and that's the thoughtful approach to it. And like most teachers, well, all teachers really, we generate our own assessments, don't we? We really need to consider grouping components by learning standards so that we make our analysis of the data easier. You may even have access to a program that will provide you analytic reports that shows several different questions that are aligned to one or more learning standards. And after a given assessment, you want to look at those questions aligned to that standard. For example, here's a key where the items are grouped by learning standard. You can see we have 8.1.1 atomic structure, 8.1.2 counting atoms, and 8.1.3 balancing equations. Atomic structure, there are 3 questions on. Counting atoms, there's 3 questions on, and we have 4 questions on balancing equations. By looking at all of those together, we can see student mastery on some of those objectives. So it really helps us look at how we can understand the standards, but we also need to look at a benchmark. Sometimes 70% is usually our normal benchmark of assessing if students have a certain mastery of a certain standard, but it can go anywhere between 30, 40%, 80%, just depends on the assessment that you're using.
Okay, so let's look at some data. I created a sample set of data.
Ooh, that looks nice, Whitney.
Isn't that lovely?
I love that. Look at your Excel skills.
I used those same learning standards over atomic structure and counting atoms and chemical formulas. And I want to use this data to just point out a few different things. First of all, let's look at the individual students. I have them over there on the left-hand side. And let's pick one to look at. Let's take a look at Daffy Duck. Okay, so looking at Daffy Duck.
He's one smart duck.
One smart duck. Looking across the row, I see that he got all 3 of the questions on atomic structure right. So I color-coded that green, because he did very well, and 100% is as good as we can expect. So I'm pretty confident in Daffy Duck's skills describing the structure of atoms. Then I'm looking over there at the other standard, counting atoms in a chemical formula. And Daffy Duck got 2 of 3, which isn't bad, but it's not quite as good. So I would begin to question, how are we doing in that particular objective? And what I think is really interesting about Daffy is if we consider the fact that he got 5 out of the 6 total questions right, his overall grade would have been an 83. He probably would have been happy with that. I probably would have been happy with that as the teacher. But looking at it from that perspective does not quite paint the whole picture. So we really have to break it apart by learning objective to start to understand where are the deficiencies. Let's look now at the classroom data, which I have down there at the bottom. So I just went through and calculated a percentage of how many students in the class were able to answer each question successfully. And the thing that stands out to me immediately is that although there's an awful lot of yellow on my spreadsheet, the class data is red on both objectives. So if I were just looking at grades overall, I would probably think we were scoring much higher. But by parsing it out this way, it reveals that the entire class is performing a little bit lower than I would like to see on those learning standards. Another thing to point out, look at question 3 in particular. So question 3, only 4 of my students were able to answer that question successfully, and that's concerning. So my gut reaction might be to say, well, they just didn't know how to do that. But I probably need to go back and look at that question because maybe this is pointing to an issue on the quality of the question itself. Maybe that question needs to be thrown out altogether. So,
Whitney, I think that's great. I mean, you really showed me how to look at my data in a thoughtful way, and to really look at how data can reveal patterns in student learning and in my own practice. So that was really great. I think also something else to point out is not just to look at class data or individual student data, but also look at your subpopulations as well.
Absolutely.
And see how they're doing. Sometimes that can we can forget about looking at that.
yeah, exactly.
So Whitney, we talked already a lot about what is data, assessments, collecting data, breaking down the data. But for me, the big question is, okay, what do I do with it?
Well, there's a lot of different things you can do with it, but for me, I think what I would start with is to create collaborative student groups in my classroom. There's a couple of different ways you can go about that. The first thing to think about is creating homogeneously grouped students. Those are students who are performing about the same on their assessments, and maybe I put them together so that I can work with them as a small group, or maybe I put them together because they have a slightly different version of an assignment. So there's different ways that I can use that type of grouping to benefit the learning experience for the entire class. But we can also group them heterogeneously, so that maybe I put some higher performing students together in a small group with lower performing students.
I love that idea.
Yeah, it's
That's
really cool
good.
because it helps establish some leadership in your classroom too. And those students that are performing a little bit better on certain topics can then become the teachers themselves. We can do peer-to-peer instruction.
Yeah.
Maybe they even create little classroom communities where they're working together to solve problems and they don't know it, but maybe the groups are based on their achievement overall. Another thing that we can do, and I think we talked about this just a minute ago, is we can do some differentiation. So after I have this data and I have a good picture of which kids are performing well and meeting the benchmarks and which are not, maybe I can then make some decisions and modify my instruction slightly. Maybe they have slightly different versions of assignments. Maybe they get a slightly different version of an assessment. Maybe they receive different instruction. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff in there. And we can also do remediation for our kiddos that are not performing well. We can also use that information to determine what specific activities or instruction would help them to improve their progress in that particular area.
Yeah, I think another good thing that you could do is allow students to take ownership of their own learning. I think a lot of times teachers, we hold our data and it's for the adults, or it's somehow, not supposed to be given to the students. But giving students their own data can actually motivate students and can encourage them to do better, because the students are tracking where they need to go. At the beginning, if you could give students a diagnostic, they can set goals for what objectives they want to master and when, and what opportunities they're going to take to do that.
Yeah, and they can also make decisions about what goals are reasonable.
Yeah.
You know, not everybody needs to shoot for
Right.
100% all of the time, but
Right.
as long as you're growing, that's huge for students to be able
part.
to see that.
Right, I think that's really the important part. If they see their progress, it just, there's that sense of it's more engaging for the students. I feel like too, and it's also, there's more transparency. You know, it breaks down those barriers and those walls.
Yeah, you know, you can also, as you learn which concepts are a little bit more difficult for students, you can also use that information in deciding which concepts you're going to bring in throughout the school year when you do some spiraling. You know, lots of people bring in those things that maybe their students didn't perform so well on as a warm-up, or maybe they assign them some extra reading, or, you know, just keep those concepts fresh on the student's mind throughout the entire year. Not only that, but if you're one of those lucky people that gets to go through high-stakes testing at the end of the year, you can decide then which concepts you need to for sure review prior to that high-stakes test at the end of the year.
Yeah, that's really good. Also, something that you can do with students is offer them alternative assignments. So a student that's done really well at the beginning of the year on a pre-assessment, you know, don't just have that student go through the same learning progression that other students who haven't mastered the concepts might go through. So one thing that you can do is give that student an opportunity maybe for independent research, or some type of differentiated study. I think that really can foster a great learning environment for your students.
Yeah, you know, that's huge for your bored students. If they're bored because they already know the material, then now you have that concrete data to support sending them on some other, you know, independent project.
Right, that's great. Yeah, and also utilizing online resources for, you know, additional practice or extensions for students. So using data to work with kids on what types of online resources they can use, because there's so much out there, and sometimes we don't really know what students should be using. So data can inform what students do online.
Absolutely. Another thing too is this gives you a good solid dialogue to have with parents. You know, you can communicate with parents and be very inefficient by saying, you know, your student is having trouble in my class, please send them to tutoring. That, you know, that's not enough. So by having a firm grasp on the data, you can then point to the specific areas where that student is struggling, and maybe even provide them some resources to use at home. You know, I noticed your student was struggling with this idea of counting atoms in a chemical formula. Here are some websites that might be helpful to you. Please check these out at home. That kind of stuff. And also I wanted to say too, you know, once you have your data and you've got a good idea of what's going on with your students, use that data to talk to other teachers, especially for those students who are struggling, because you're going to be making decisions about accommodations or grade placement, etc. And you need to be able to help paint the picture of that student's progress in all of the content areas.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think sometimes we look at data within the confines of just one assessment. But if you look at data across multiple assessments, it can really give you a rich view of how students are doing, if they're improving or if they're not improving and they need additional support. So that longitudinal analysis of data is really important. But I think sometimes we question, well, how do we store it? What do we do? Paper and pencil. And right now we don't just have to use paper and pencil.
Right.
There's a lot of online management systems out there that you can use to look at data. One online system that you can use that I've heard of, STEMscopes. STEMscopes has a great way to do this as well, but like many other systems do, they're similar in the regard that you have a list of your students, and we'll look at one right now, but you can see your students in the left-hand column usually, and it lists all of your students by a particular class. It'll even color code your students on currently where they're at in terms of mastering the entire curriculum, or what the curriculum you've taught up to date. you can also see that throughout the columns that for each of the concepts that students have to learn, you'll have arrows, green or red arrows that will tell you, if the student has mastered that assessment through, a progress monitoring, or even a post-assessment, or and if the student is improving, or if the student is not improving. And I think that can really help show you throughout a long term how students are doing, and it will really provide you or provide all of us as teachers an opportunity to provide some rich assessments and opportunities for students.
Absolutely. Most school districts do have some sort of platform for storing this kind of data that we're discussing. If you're not familiar with it, then ask around. And if you do have something, then definitely invest some time in learning that system. Familiarize yourself with the reports that it offers, and just kind of dive right into that data.
Yeah, don't be afraid.
Don't be afraid. So what do you do with last year's data?
Last year's data. You mean that data I threw in the file box
that's
in
stuff.
my storage closet
Yes.
that I forgot about over the summer? No, I think to be serious, it's one thing about looking at data from previous years is that it's really hard to compare from one school year to another your student data, because your students are different and there's entirely different groups. However, one thing that you can do is across multiple years, look at the data in terms of comparing how students did overall on certain concepts, because that can really inform your teaching practice. It can also inform maybe some ideas of some professional development for the summer, some books to read, some things to do, some content knowledge that you may need to brush up on. So I think that can give you a good view if you look at that. But also, I think what's really important, if you drill down to the student, is to look at your incoming students' data. I know that can be tricky, but looking at standardized test data, you can get a snapshot and see where students are and already start to look at where you need to go with students. Also, I would say look at student work portfolios too. Look at their writing. Look at their computational skills. That can come into play as well. But I would say really what's most important, and to me this is data, is the conversations that you have with a student's previous teacher from year to year. That can really help.
It can help, but I would throw out this word of caution too, that sometimes teachers want to just tell you all about their behavior and things that aren't going to be that helpful in deciding how you're going to handle that student. So remember that the conversations you have with previous year's teachers should be about which systems are working for that student, have worked in the past, and which ones of those can you continue to move forward with as you get that student for the upcoming school year.
Yeah, you really have to be cognizant to channel that conversation in the appropriate way. So,
absolutely.
But one thing I'm really kind of fearful of with data is sharing that with other colleagues, because I can feel a little intimidated, or if my data isn't good enough. But I know I sometimes just really have to think it's for the betterment of the students. It's for the betterment of me as a practitioner and a professional.
Yeah, I think we take our data so personally because it is a reflection of us, and we take our teaching so personally. And so you're right, it is very hard, but I just try to keep this in mind. What's best for kids is best for all kids.
Yeah.
So if your colleague down the hallway has this amazing lesson on the structure of atoms, and consistently their kids are outperforming your students, then there's a conversation there that needs to happen, because that lesson is something that could benefit your students too.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, you have to be honest with yourself. If something isn't working, you need to fix it. That's good.
Absolutely.
That's really good.
Yeah. So we're going to switch over and look at our Twitter feed.
Twitter.
And see if we have any questions coming in on Twitter. So it looks like we have one from @CyMcGee.
Okay.
And she says, what do you do if you're teaching a subject and you do not have state test data in your subject from previous years? That's a really good question.
No, that is a good question. And I think, it may not even be as a class, but you may get a student in the middle of the year and you may have no data on that student. And sometimes files can take months to transfer, and you can't wait months to start with students and know where they are. I think it's really important that what you do is you have a collection of evaluation tools and resources that are aligned to your standards, whether it be multiple choice or whether it be short answer, in a different variety of ways, that you can put together a diagnostic assessment and see where students are. So you have that data readily available to you right on the get-go when you start in August and December and you're not waiting.
Yeah, I actually did that, and I think that a lot of times our assessments tend to assess sometimes above the level of the standard, and so it was kind of hard to get a good picture if I was just using those as a diagnostic tool. So I used questions that some might think were low level, but I did make sure that they were aligned to the standard and they were at the appropriate level. And I just compiled those and had maybe 20 or 30 questions on an assessment. And I actually gave it to all of my students at the beginning of the school year, just to kind of get a baseline for where they were at on those important content areas.
Yeah. No, that's a great idea. That really is.
All right, let's see what else we have. Okay, so this one is from @mom to Ella Thomas, and she says, what do you think the hardest part of using data to inform instruction is for classroom teachers?
Well, that question really gets to the heart of what I feel is this entire conversation, because so many times we can give test after test after test in the benchmarking, and we think that just by giving a test it can improve student performance. But what's really important about that is that you look at that data, that you do something with the data. I always used to tell my teachers as a principal is, don't give a test just to give a test for practice. Do it to enrich your practice and do it to evaluate where students are at a certain point. So to me, it really is doing something with it. And it's like you said, Whitney, in our talk, differentiating and small grouping or whole grouping, providing those ways in an informative, purposeful way in which you conduct your instruction, I think is the key to using data.
Yeah, I think a really hard thing is just establishing it as part of your routine. It's very easy to start the school year out with these great intentions of dissecting data and making a plan to use that data. And then it's one of those things that sometimes just sort of falls by the wayside. But make the commitment to make that part of your routine, maybe once a week. Maybe once a month you're meeting with your colleagues, maybe once every 2 weeks. Just find a system that works for you, and because it is so very good for your students, commit to seeing it through the entire school year.
Yeah, and like you said, use your colleagues to hold each other accountable. Don't let it fall through. Use those professional learning community meetings, those chair team meetings, grade level teams. That's the time to do this and to do this work.
Absolutely.
So what else do we have?
I think we have one more question. This one is also from @mom to Ella Thomas. So
she's very popular tonight.
Yes, she is. Thank you for all of those fabulous questions. She says, how does an admin use classroom data for the campus?
How does an admin use data for the campus?
Well, I don't know, Reid. You are the principal.
No, that's a really great point, or a really good question, I think, that she brings up. One thing that you have to do as administrators is you have to not just talk what you say, but walk what you say, and do what you say. And by that I mean that it's important that administrators use data as well, and you can use data collectively. By looking at data across classrooms and grade levels, you can actually see what are some systemic issues in the school that you need to improve upon. It may be an intensive reading program, accelerated math program, or it may be more STEM opportunities for students. And by collecting data across the continuum, you can really, that informs your practice to implement those programs. And it also gives you a basis, so when teachers are saying, why are we doing this program, you have that rich data, and it's important it gives you a basis of where to start the conversation, I feel.
Well, I'll speak from an instructional coaching standpoint also. I would have used data as a means to foster conversations between teachers. We talked earlier about discrepancies in data between teachers, and I would have used this data to come to them and say, all right, guys, what are we going to do to fix this? Because it is my job as an instructional coach to guarantee that every student on this campus receives a high-quality learning experience. So if we have these kinds of discrepancies, then that tells me we have a problem. So I think more than anything, it's important to remember, though, that an administrator is trying trying to help students.
Yep.
And so while sometimes these conversations about data may be awkward or slightly uncomfortable, or may make us confront some of our weaknesses as a teacher, they really are so, so important to have.
Yeah, and one final thing I think that's important is we need to make sure that administrators don't use the data punitively, but use it to inform the practice and improvement of the teachers and students.
Mm-hmm. So, what are your last thoughts?
Well, I would think that it's really important just to say that data is not just data. That we need to look at students, and we need to look at the contextual factors that come into play as well. Are they engaged? Are they excited? Are they learning? That's important too. Reid,
while you were talking, I was listening, but I was also reading the Twitter feed because we have a few more questions.
Okay, all right. Well,
keep them coming, guys.
Very popular tonight.
Keep them coming. This is from @LauraArch. So, hi, @LauraArch.
Hello, Laura.
And she says, how do you get students to track their own data and take responsibility for rising scores without overdoing it?
So, that's a really good question. And again, I think it goes back to the transparency with students. Sometimes there can be some concern of students sharing data with other students, or showing the data across as posters and publicly doing that. I found that the most successful method is that relationship between the teacher and the student, and the student having access to how they're progressing, whether that be some type of tracking chart in their agenda, or that could even be so much as conversational pieces on their iPad. But if teachers on a daily basis can give feedback to students on where they're going or where they need to go, that can be very, very, very important. So that students can know that they're succeeding, but it's the teacher's responsibility, and it's the relationship, because if that student feels safe in knowing their data, then the student can use it successfully.
Yeah, and I will say too, one thing is kids will work for an incentive, and so one thing that I used to do was quit talking to them about percentages, because it's a little bit abstract.
It
so,
is.
We would look at some data, and I might say, last time we taught this, you got 3 out of 5 questions right. Next time, let's shoot for 4 out of 5 questions.
Right.
And that is much more concrete. And so now they're not like trying to achieve some percentage that they can't really grasp, but they know they just need one more question.
Or if they get something, color code it green. If it's like create a little tracking bar, and the ones you got wrong, color in red. The ones you green. If you see more green than red, you're doing well on that objective.
Right.
If you see more red, you just need to work on that objective. Or you can use a different color, blue or yellow, and that can help a student too.
Yeah, and then maybe once they reach their goal that they've set, they get some special prize.
Yes,
and it doesn't have to be anything expensive.
Pizza.
It can be something very simple.
Right.
Kids will work for pencils.
Right.
So just keep it simple. All right, let's see, what else do we have? Goodness gracious, there's quite a few here. Let's pick one.
One more?
We'll
do one more. How about that?
Okay, this is a good one. This is from Laura Brumlow. Hi,
Hello,
Laura.
Ms. Brumlow.
And she says, where does data collection and analysis go wrong, and how can we use it right?
That's another good question.
A great question.
And one thing that we talked about is you need to use data in a formative way to improve practice and to improve instruction. Too many times we use data as it's all or none, as an extreme measure, and using it. We even use it sometimes to see if teachers have jobs or not. And while sometimes data can come into play, data should be used more to inform how you can always do better, how the teacher or how the student can always do better. It's building upon each other in a progressive way. And when you can see performance and improvement, and if you use data strategically and wisely, that most assuredly that performance and progression will come.
Yeah. I think when you've reached a point where you have binders and binders and binders and binders of data, then maybe you've gone too far.
Yeah.
That's
an extreme.
It's an extreme. You need
Unless you use it as a doorstop.
then, yeah, there you go. You need to have enough data that you have an accurate picture of where the students are growing and where they still have more room for growth, but not so much that you begin to see your student just as a walking, talking source of data.
Yeah.
You know, that's too far.
Yeah, exactly. You got to take all the other factors in mind.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It's important.
Okay.
So is that enough of Twitter?
I think so.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for your questions. Those were very thoughtful and
great
thoughtful questions. And
thank you.
I felt it really helped our talk. So, great.
Yeah.
Well, in closing, what are just a few things that you have that you wanna say before we close for the night?
Well, I think we talked an awful lot about data, and it is an important piece of the instructional puzzle, and its importance should not be ignored. Every teacher should make a commitment to gather, organize, analyze, and implement the things that they've learned from their data. But I also want to just make the case that it's not everything.
Yeah.
It's just data.
It's not the end all be all.
It's not the end all be all. And the student is going to perform best in a situation where a teacher is genuinely concerned with their success. And then it's really about seeing that student reach their full potential.
Yep. No, I think so. And I think another point that we need to make is that you need to be prepared for surprises in your data and on your assessments. You need to look at those anomalies and outliers. If all of your students didn't score right on a question, it may not be because they didn't understand the concept. It may just be because that question was written wrong or it was poorly coded. So we have to take all of those factors into mind when we look at our data, so that we think in a thoughtful way of how to use that data for our students. Because sometimes it can go the wrong way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're looking at data and you're not really sure what the data is trying to tell you. Reach out to get help. There are going to be people on your campus, in your district, around you that have been doing this for a long time and are considered experts in using data to drive instruction. So reach out to those people and use them as a resource.
Yep. And I would just say at the end, data isn't everything, but it's a very powerful tool. And get comfortable, and once you start using it, I don't think you'll ever go back.
No.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Reid. Well, this has been fun.
Is it over already?
It's over.
Man.
I've learned so much.
I learned so much too, Whitney. Thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed doing this with you, and I look forward to doing it again soon.
Yes.
So, great. Well, everybody, I just want to thank you for joining us to talk about data here. And please tune in next time on September 9th.
Yes.
Do you have it on your calendar?
I do. I'll be here.
September 9th, 2015 for our next STEM Talk on STEM Coach at stemcoach.com, where STEM starts here.
That's right.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks.